for patterns, tricks, stitches and tips, wands and needles, embroidery.
In this video, I'm going to demonstrate wagon wheel roses, also called woven roses, and we're going to look at a couple different ways that these can be done. The first way is to start the wagon wheel rose from the very center, which is going to look like this one right here. And then the second way that we can do this stitch is to add a different stitch to the center. Typically, this will be French knots. And then we're going to work the wagon wheel rose around that center. And that's going to look like this rose here. And this stitch is going to consist of 2 to 3 elements, which are going to include the center if you're adding one. And then we're going to have the spokes of the wheel, which you can see on this example here. And then those are going to provide the foundation of this stitch. And finally, we'll have the stitches which will weave over and under those spokes on top of the fabric, which is what we'll ultimately see once the rose is completed. So you can see I already added my French knots to the center of this rose. And now I can go ahead and add my spokes. I'm going to start at the outside edge and then work in toward the center. One thing to keep in mind with your spokes is that you always want an odd number versus an even number of spokes, with a smaller number for a smaller rose and then a larger number of spokes for a larger rose. Typically, somewhere between 3 to 7 spokes is going to be sufficient. So you can see on this smaller rose here, I have just the 3 spokes, and then on the larger one, I have 7. And then the one I'm working on, I have just the 5. Once I have my spokes in place, I'm going to bring my needle up through the back of my fabric, really close to the center of the rose, and just adjacent to any of the spokes. It doesn't really matter which one. I'm going to bring that needle up through, and then I'm going to begin those woven stitches. I'm just going to work my needle over and under, alternating as I go around each of the spokes. And I can do this in a clockwise or counterclockwise motion. It doesn't matter. I just want to pick a direction and then stick with that. And so this kind of shows why we want that odd number of spokes, because with an even number, we're not going to get that alternating pattern, and it's not going to create the same look. The other thing I really want to be careful of as I'm stitching these is not to snag any nearby stitches, because this stitch is worked almost entirely on the top of the fabric. It can get easy to kind of run that needle into nearby stitches, and then you end up with a bit of a mess. So just want to try to angle that needle a little bit to make sure I'm not running into anything adjacent. And then the other thing I can do is to put a little pressure from the back side of the fabric to kind of lift the needle, and that can kind of help it go up and over some of those nearby stitches. So I'm just going to continue in that alternating pattern until my rose is filled up. Highly recommend just going slow and taking your time with the stitch. I find that when I get in too big of a hurry, that's when I really start running into some trouble, start snagging stitches and getting things in a bit of a mess. Now, if I run out of thread before my rose is filled, that's not a problem. I just want to make sure that I take care of that before I get too low on thread. I want to have enough to knot off my thread at the back of my fabric. So I'm just going to bring my needle down right beside one of the spokes that I would be weaving underneath. And then I'll knot everything off in the back. Then I can rethread my needle, and I'm going to bring my needle back up just on the other side of that same spoke. So it's going to give the same effect as if I had woven underneath that spoke. And then I'll just proceed as I was previously, just alternating, weaving over and under each of my spokes until I've filled up my rows. One final thing to keep in mind is your thread tension. You want to make sure that you're pulling the thread snug but not too tight, which can end up distorting the shape of your rows. Once your rose is filled in, you can go ahead and bring that needle back down through to the back of your fabric, going down again next to a spoke that you would normally be weaving underneath. And then you're going to just go ahead and knot everything off, and you have a beautifully filled in woven rose. Now to start in the middle and work the entire rose from the very center, you're just going to really start out the same way. You're going to work your spokes first from the outside edge towards the center. And then you're just going to go all the way to the center with your spoke. So we'll go ahead and add our 3 spokes here. Once my spokes are all in place, then I'm just going to bring my needle back up through the back of my fabric, really close to the center, and right next to any of the spokes I choose. Again, it doesn't really matter. Pulling that thread through to the front of the fabric. And then we're just going to, again, start weaving over and under each of those spokes, alternating as we go. To create that woven rose effect. And again, we're just going to keep doing that until we've filled in the entire rose. I'm going to go ahead and show you one more trick that I do like to use for woven roses, and that is to use a curved needle. This is not a foolproof method, but I find that it really does help when you're working in the tight spaces on top of the fabric to really minimize, um, snagging those adjacent stitches. It just really helps to be able to work into those tight spaces a little easier. It does take a little getting used to. It can feel a little awkward at first, but I really encourage you to just kind of give it a try, see what you think, practice with it a little. I think you'll find that you really enjoy it for this type of stitch. Just going to continue in that alternating pattern, going over and under each of my spokes until my rose is filled in. Once my rose is filled in, I like to go ahead and switch back to my straight needle. And then I'm going to bring my thread back down through to the back of my fabric, going down again really close to one of the spokes that I would be weaving underneath. And then I can go ahead and knot everything off, and my rose is complete. And that is how you do wagon wheel or woven roses.